I never felt hatred for my body, and it was my thinking mind that was fighting against it.
The poet Diana Goetsch is here to talk about her new book, This Body I Wore, which our reviewer calls an achingly beautiful memoir about a trans woman's often vexed relationship with her own body.
By the end of the book, I come out into a place of telling a kind of static love story or slow-growing love story, and what does it mean to not conflate drama with love?
C.J. Hauser talks about her essay collection, The Crane Wife, including the title piece, which went viral when the Paris Review published it in 2019. Plus, Alexandra Alter will have news from the publishing world, and my colleagues Jumana Khatib and Lauren Christensen will be here to talk about what they've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's July 22nd. I'm John Williams. Diana Goetsch is here. She is the acclaimed author of 8 poetry collections. Her new book is a memoir called This Body I Wore. In the New York Times Book Review, Manuel Betancourt calls it an achingly beautiful memoir about a trans woman's often vexed relationship with her own body. What would it be like to be a girl? That question may have felt immense when she was younger, but here and now, Goetsch presents it with such clarity that it bowls one over. Diana, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you, John. Wonderful to join you and the podcast.
So, you start the book in 1987. I'm going to get to that in 1 minute. But before that, I want to take you back to when you were younger, because you write later in the book, I'd fantasized all my life about being a girl. And when you say all your life, I wonder if you could bring us back to that moment when you were very young and what those fantasies felt like, and whether you as a young child, what you made of those, whether they felt like anything or just sort of your mind at work.
On the one hand, when I look back, it was a very full experience of transness, and yet there was zero perception. So it was also an experience of blindness and not really being able to decode or just make any sense of any of the things happening to me. I had this, I call it an epiphany, when I was a small child. Many little epiphanies, wondering if someone was a boy or a girl, or seeing a woman with, a crew cut and breasts, or just having my brain explode to see another woman's shiny black hair. And then all these fantasies that just came in. And because I didn't know what they meant, it felt like I was being invaded from outer space as a kid. I mean, it was the only language I had. They just knocked me sideways. They scared the heck out of me. And then I'd immediately go blind to them again out of maybe fear.
Because I assume just at a very young age, because are we talking 5, 6, that young? Before, even younger. So even from younger than that, maybe an internalized sense from the culture around you that this was something you were, quote unquote, supposed to be scared of?
Oh, yeah. No, tremendously dangerous due to my culture, frankly, due to my family. My family was not a place where you could really express yourself. It was a code of silence. But, a lot of people had families like that. And if there wasn't a code of silence in a family, there certainly was one around this area. We didn't have the words gender identity.
Where were you growing up?
Well, we moved from Brooklyn to Queens, and then out to Stony Brook when I was 5. And so between age 5 and 10, we were there not far from the university, in these suburbs that they had just built onto potato fields, out in Stony Brook, the great barbecue of Long Island.
I was born in Oceanside, so fellow Long Island.
God. Yeah, I mean, everyone was siphoning their income from New York City and commuting, but my mother called it the rotten apple. And, there we all were in the suburbs where nothing ever happened. Even if it did, it didn't. It was this enforced comfort and consumerism.
Well, let's fast forward to 1987. Now you're, I believe, 24. And in the scene that opens the book, tell us how you're feeling and also maybe why you wanted to open the book there.
The scene that opens the book, I think I just call it the prologue. I, for the very first time in my life, consider suicide. And, I don't know where on the scale of suicide I am, ideation or planning or whatever, but I just say maybe it would be better if I wasn't alive. And on the heels of that thought came this other thought, okay, maybe it's time to go out as a woman. If you're going to die, at least do this once. And I've since heard this called a death gift. And apparently I wasn't the only trans person that gave themselves such a gift. And that moment may have saved my life because I needed to open up to who I was in a more fully embodied way.
I don't want to be reductive because that's a very powerful and disturbing moment, but was there a kind of immediate relief How did you feel after you did that in terms of those darker feelings?
There was, I guess, this overwhelming sense of excitement. And it's as if I finally gave in to what I at some point call the siren song of femininity, this call that was so mysterious. It had no future. There was no place that I could see in a culture to be this person, this female being. And yet without it, I somehow didn't feel satisfied. So I was kind of nourishing myself with this satisfaction, although my problems were far from over. I didn't know what to do with it, but at least I could feel it and I could give myself to that. I think it exploded my pleasure center, even though ultimately your identity, it wasn't about sexuality, but that's what we use sometimes in order to process what can't otherwise be processed. We kind of use the libido. And I just felt like I needed to open up to this. And it was this unbelievable turn on.
So you're in your early to mid 20s when this happens, but what were the years before that like in terms of your college years, your understanding of your gender or sexuality leading up to that moment when you decided to give yourself that moment?
Like a lot of closeted and late transitioning people, I was searching and running simultaneously. In college, there's a whole chapter. I was at Wesleyan University, and it's a chapter where I'm just using college to look for myself, using these courses in gender studies, which weren't really courses in gender at all. They were very political, these courses, and just investigating my messed up self. And the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, really didn't have any language for me. It was the language of deviance. And then if I move into a space of cross-dressing or people who were in these bars that I first frequented, the language there was very vulgar or paltry or just inexact. And I was just searching. I mean, ironically, I thought that coming out to myself as a cross-dresser and even telling girlfriends, okay, let me be bold and tell you who I am, which actually turned out to be a way of shoving the fact that I was a trans woman even further into the closet.
How old were you when you came out as a crossdresser to people?
I guess I started having these adult relationships pretty late, actually, in my 30s. I'd stayed away. I isolated myself like a lot of trans people do.
To go back to Wesleyan, which I think of as a very progressive place, and you mentioned that the classes on gender were political, I wonder what, at the time, did they think they were being progressive, but it was just stalled out? Or what were they teaching about gender then, and what did you take from it or fight against from it?
Well, they didn't know a damn thing about gender. And what they thought was gender was really women. And it was that kind of thing with patriarchy. Women have to think about their gender about 90% of the time, and men only had to think about it 10% of the time. It's a little like race. Black people have to think about race enormously more than white people. Basically, it was women's studies, and it was a pitched battle. It was second wave feminism. Many of the people taking these classes were furious, and they had a right to be furious. But then, I was called this potential rapist to my face by women who didn't even know me. And it was a hard place to just really have a genuine question about gender. What is this? And how can I maybe get a foothold into some of my confusion?
Because you were asking these questions maybe in the classroom or these public spaces without really having come to your own answers yet. You were still grappling with them internally too. So was there a sense that you were kind of just aggressively trying to get conversation started and people didn't even want to do that?
I pretty much kept to myself, John. I wasn't even trying to start conversations, but I was quietly doing the research, taking the classes, and just disappointed by the fact that the gender studies weren't studying anything about gender, the nature of gender. It was more, I call the chapter Woman Good, Man Bad, because they were offering up these heroes of feminism, nothing against any of them, versus the patriarchy. People were being equipped to do battle with Freud and others, which is all well and good, but I was trying to look for, answers to my own confusion. So I did a lot of reading, and none of it added up to anything.
Your early years in New York City then, after college, and you are in New York in 1987, and that episode we discussed earlier. What did arriving in New York open up for you in terms of experience? And also, what effect did it have or didn't have yet on your larger understanding of yourself?
Initially, it was a tremendous opening. My first stop was the New York Public Library. And again, that was not helpful, reading all this science and research. And then I turned to New York itself. And I started going to these clubs, these kind of speakeasy underground type places. There were these drag strip clubs. There were these prostitution spots that kept getting raided by the police, where a lot of people were looking for transsexual women and so forth. But being there, I really experienced them for myself as this place of dreams, that these people were just trying to live the life they urgently wanted to live. And then I started dressing and joining them in certain ways, not to be a sex worker, but just to partake in a feminine presentation and relating to the world differently. And it was kind of the only available spots we had. And for a while, it sustained me. And then I started to get really troubled about the rest of my life. What am I doing with my life? And I had these other dreams that I thought were masculine dreams of family and partnering with women because I was attracted to women, and career, and none of which could survive if people knew these things about me.
Were you writing poetry back then? Did this have any effect on your creative life or vice versa?
It didn't have an effect on my creative life. I was beginning to write poetry as well. I was starting to train and become a poet. But the thing with poetry is that you can write it in code because you're kind of writing the reader's life, which is what one great poet talks about. Someone like Cole Porter, who is writing the Great American Songbook, even though he was a gay man, all these heterosexual people were falling in love to Cole Porter songs. And later, Elton John, who was writing in code and could not come out as gay. And meanwhile, he was suffering intensely. And, I was writing these poems that didn't last for that long. And people assume what happens in a poem is true, which is great. And so I was essentially a love poet. I could do that. I could actually do it with depth, and people could value it, and we could all have some fun. But it didn't get anywhere near what I was most questioning about myself.
You started writing about your experiences in a more memoiristic way for The American Scholar on a blog on their website, which was quite popular. Tell me about the early reactions to that blog, and also eventually what role that might have played, if it did, in your deciding to write this book.
The early reactions I got were, at least the ones I valued the most, were of the universality of what I was doing. And that actually was my agenda. I wanted to do something literary, which meant to put a little bit of you on every page, even if it was this incredibly strange sliver of transgender experience, strange to most people. But I started hearing from people about somebody was on chemo, and a woman who would lose a lot of her feminine characteristics in terms of voice or smoothness of skin or hair or what have you. And she was relating to some of the changes I was going through. Other women on hormone replacement therapy, gay men still afraid to come out, people who knew trans people. I even heard from my poetry editor, Roger Lathbury at Archaises, who told me his name used to be Roger Lewis, and he changed his name. And there was one blog post that involved a name change. And he wrote to me and he said, "Oh my God, I relate to this."
Was there something about those reactions that made you feel emboldened that this was going to reach a very broad audience, that a memoir would be interesting to pretty much everyone?
I always assumed it, but I just didn't have the vehicle. I mean, my assumption always as a poet and as a writer is I'm a generalist. And I just think the most idiosyncratic thing about ourselves also happens to be the most universal if we can get to it and present it in the right way, not as self-expression, but as something we could offer, and with a confidence that everyone could see themselves if it was written well enough. So there was that sense, but then I didn't know if I could do it. So it was never my primary objective to give information about a transition, even if somebody's initial attraction is prurient and they just want that. And they can now get that on Wikipedia or something. But I particularly love artists who have what I call the common touch, Bruce Springsteen has the common touch. My old mentor, William Zinsser, has the common touch. The ability to say something very well, but also not exclude anyone from it at the same time.
Now that you mention that, let's zoom out a little bit, because this is obviously, in addition to your own story, there are so many conversations going on in the culture at large about this issue these days. And you write in the book at one point, you call the word, or this might have been on the blog, you called cisgender a quote, sloppy but sometimes useful word. How do you feel about people trying to get up to speed on some of these things? And in terms of not excluding anyone, what is your stance in terms of the best way to have these conversations and to approach people about them who still have, if not outright bigotry, fear and confusion around it?
Well, I would probably now edit myself up to date and say cisgender has become a necessary word. You know, when it first started out, you didn't know which of these terms were going to survive and which weren't going to survive. There are now categories in our country with regard to who you can have a conversation with. And there are some people that it's important actually not to try to enter a conversation with. There's a great quote from James Baldwin, and I'm sure I'm going to mangle it, but to paraphrase the quote, it's, you know, he can love you and support your opinion on anything as long as that opinion doesn't dehumanize him. But when you want to present a position that dehumanizes him or anyone, there is no conversation. It is, in fact, an intentional canceling of the conversation by that other person, not by me. So when I'm in that conversation, I get out of it. But then again, there's other people who are available and who can relate. Where we were 4 or 5 years ago when I was writing the blog is a very different place from now. 4 or 5 years ago, it was this trans visibility explosion and a kind of natural backlash that was happening. It wasn't fun, but you kind of expected it. Like at first we thought there was a backlash to Obama, but then it became fascism or apartheid or something on the way to totalitarian, authoritarian types of moves where it's not backlash anymore. It's actually a coordinated campaign in all these different state houses to erase us. So I'm very careful now in these conversations to see, okay, where are these people and who can be helped and saved?
Speaking of that change over recent years, you're a writer and a teacher and you're busy with your creative life. Has that change over the last few years put you more in an activist mindset? Are you spending more time than you had in the past confronting some of those cultural battles?
I am. I think for starters, I'm taking in more news and I'm taking in more information. And often the way I watch the news, and excuse me, that includes the New York Times, is I go to papers and I see if they're doing their job. And I'm looking for the word fascism, if only as something to check against what's happening. You know, what is this checklist? So I'm informing myself along these lines. And my tendency now is to not isolate onto the suffering of trans people, even though the suffering is large and I want to address it. I think what's happening is they're looking for Reichstag fires. They're looking for every possible way they can divide us. So it could be Black Lives Matter and Black history text and banning the knowledge of that, voter disenfranchisement, which is more than just suppression, or what's going on with Roe versus Wade and going after women and their freedom sexually and economically. To isolate only on trans people would be to play into their hands because they're lighting fires everywhere. And I'm looking for opportunities as a writer to say what isn't being said. I'm not going to pile on. If someone's doing a good job saying something, I don't need to say it. But I'm looking for what people aren't yet saying. And I'm very happy to jump into that breach.
From incipient fascism to something gentler, but also maybe in some ways related. You're a trained Buddhist. And I'm interested in that subject in general, but I'm also interested in when you started studying and what role, if any, that has played in your own view of yourself throughout the years, and also maybe even the way that you've come to make decisions about things in your life.
Buddhism enabled me to sit with not knowing and to let go and stop all the questions, at least for a while. and see what comes up, and then maybe go with comes up, and trust the body. And I think it was particularly good for me because my path as someone who needed to come out as trans is maybe a little different from a lot of other paths in that I never felt hatred for my body. In fact, for me, it was my body that was telling me that I needed to transition. It all came from the body, very, very deep desires. And it was my thinking mind that was fighting against it, worried about survival or what will happen or etc. A lot of fear, a lot of cowardice, frankly, but a lot of fear.
Well, you touch on Buddhism in the book, as well as everything else we've discussed. I should say that you certainly bring your poet's sensibility to it, and it is also quite funny, despite the, often harrowing things that that one goes through in finding oneself. The book, again, is a memoir titled "This Body I Wore" by Diana Goetsch. Diana, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
Oh, thank you, John. What a pleasure.
C.J. Hauser is here. She is the author of 2 novels, Family of Origin and The Frumaways, and her new book is a collection of essays, The Crane Wife. In the New York Times Book Review, Mary Laura Philpott calls it an intellectually vigorous and emotionally resonant account of how a self gets created over time. C.J., thanks for joining me to talk about it.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
The title essay of this book, The Crane Wife, is like a massive hit single. And in my experience, bands either open or close with the massive hit. And so I've made a decision to close with it and get to a few other things first.
Love it.
So let's start with the fact that I think all of these essays were written in the past few years and that you hadn't expected necessarily to write personal essays. So did all of this come flooding back, or did some of the pieces about younger times and relationships take some real memory digging?
I think that the older stories about my life were the ones that were the most intuitive to write about. And then it was the more questing, stranger pieces in the book that I found along the way, like the one about the robot convention and the one about John Belushi's grave. Those are ones that I sort of, went on walkabout for.
All of these essays are very personal. So even the robots and even John Belushi's grave and other subjects we'll get to are very much about your experiences, your thoughts about your life and your development. You call the book in its subtitle a memoir in essays, and some of these pieces are impressionistic. There's not a strict chronology to them. If it were told as a conventional memoir, what would it look like? Not to use the term elevator pitch, but what does the book get at in a larger sense about your life?
I think in a larger sense, the book is in the arc of it, hoping to think about what are the stories I was given about how to understand my own happiness and how to understand love and how to make it legible to other people and maybe even myself. And so I'm hoping that the book from beginning to end is kind of a love story of many, many people and things. It is all the things in my life I want to call a love story, which includes friendships, chosen family, my dog, a house.
And also plenty of romantic partners.
And a fair deal of romantic partners.
For better and worse.
For better and worse. That is a large part of the book as well. But I think understanding those relationships and understanding why I'm a person who has so much trouble with romantic relationships when I'm a person who is very lucky in friends and chosen family and community. Like, why can't I just get it together to do well at the other thing when I can do the one that seems to come naturally to me? And so that's a question I'm asking in the book for sure as well.
So how do you choose how to tell some of these things? I mean, I mentioned that the essays have stylistic differences. The first essay, I think, is a perfect test case to ask the question about. It's called Blood. And in it, you write about your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your parents, how they all met, about your own experiences, romantic and otherwise. But you, in fairly short pieces that jump around in time, you do this. So I'm wondering 2 things, how you came to structure it the way you did, and also, since I don't think it's an accident that this deeper field of time comes first, these generations upon generations, how does that piece color for the reader what follows in the rest of the book?
I originally was calling that essay Hope Chest because that's how I was thinking of the structure. I was thinking of when women used to be given these chests full of all the things that it was assumed you would need for your marriage. And it came from your family, and particularly the women in your family. And so I was like, if I had a hope chest, like a narrative hope chest of all these things that I was given and were passed down to me, what would that look like? So each of the little vignettes in that essay, I think of as things that were placed into the hope chest. And then I take them out and I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to need this. I'm supposed to do it this way. And to sort of question that, I think is the work of the rest of the book.
What are some of the things that you did feel like you inherited either from generations you never even met, sort of passed down from their lives in terms of the idea of love? You talk about you and your sister. At one point, there's a funny, like many things in the book, funny and also sad line where you talk about your parents looking at the both of you and thinking that you were both going to be in trouble, but in different ways in relationships.
Yeah, when we had both murdered our souvenir cacti. I think that in my family, we love stories. We're sort of Don Quixote people, and we have read so many stories, and we self-mythologize and we tell stories. And I don't know, growing up with a family where it's like one of the love stories involves a murder. One of the love stories is like we met in the theater, and it's just these grand storytelling endeavors. And I think by the end of the book, I come out into a place of telling a kind of static love story or slow growing love story. And like, what does it mean to not conflate drama with love? And does love need to be dramatic? Because I think that's a thing that I inherited.
There's also a sense of conflating taste with love. I was reminded of a line in Nick Hornby's High Fidelity, something about how if someone's favorite things, you know them, their favorite movies, their favorite music. There's high culture in the book. There's also pop culture, the great movie, The Philadelphia Story, The X-Files. There's a fleeting mention of the Muppets. You could always use more Muppets. So what role has that played in your getting close to people, and how has your vision of that changed over time? How much do you connect those things?
I love High Fidelity, and I feel like I really believed that for a long time, that line, like, your taste is yourself. And I think that was, I don't know, a thing. I love bonding with people over things I share in common with them. Of course, we all do. It feels really meaningful to be like, you also love this album. But on the flip side, sometimes if that's all you've got going for you in a dynamic, then it's not everything, right? Because it's not actually someone's whole self. I mean, maybe there's something you can learn about someone if they value Lou Reed, who I do. But I don't think that's really a deeper thing about like what I value and how I want to be in the world and how I want to connect with people. And so there's an essay that's about how I got myself into trouble by being a snob who tried to only date people who liked the same things as me. And then I, of course, as I always do, pendulum swung to the other end of the spectrum where I was like, it matters not at all. And as with most things that I think better adjusted people know intuitively, it's somewhere in the middle.
Right. That pendulum can be dangerous when it swings all the way the other way.
Yeah.
But what is it about things like the essay built around the Philadelphia Story? Sometimes people will say things like, I write to figure out what I'm thinking, which I always find a little bit, maybe I don't buy it because I don't feel that way myself. But I got a sense from these essays, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you do a lot of thinking about these things before you write, that you go through these sort of intellectual/emotional exercises, sometimes with pop culture objects, sometimes just with the experiences themselves. And then you're sort of walking us through them. You've already thought about them. Do you go through life making those connections a lot?
I think I do. And I think it's an active process on the page, which is what makes it, I don't know, enjoyable and terrifying for me as a writer. And I think normally I've come up with a kind of crackpot theory about something, say the Philadelphia Story, and I sit down to write the essay with that in mind. But part of the joy of the writing is like when my own crackpot hypothesis starts to fall apart, what do I learn about myself and about the art? And what does it mean to then complicate things and to show the deeper things or the more complex things or the things I was avoiding that like only come to light on the page? And I love taking the reader along for that ride.
That makes sense. A kind of combination of surprise and pre-knowledge.
Yes.
This sounds ideal. So we'll turn to the title essay now, and also as a way eventually of getting back into some of the other pieces in the book. But you wrote this essay called The Crane Wife. It was published on the Paris Review in, I believe, July 2019. Often when we say something goes viral, we're talking about a meme with a GIF or something. It's not often a literary essay that we're talking about, but this truly did take over Twitter and social media for a while. Describe the process of writing that piece and placing it, and also your reaction to people's reaction.
I didn't intend to write nonfiction. I am a novelist, and I was doing research for my last novel, which had a bunch of crazed scientists who were studying a duck to prove that the world was ending. And so I went to study whooping cranes as part of research for that book. And then when Family of Origin was coming out, I was writing some nonfiction pieces to be published at the same time, to be like, hi, this is who I am. This is the story of the book. And so I was truly just thinking of it as, I don't know, like the story of my research and my life. And then I got to be in the Paris Review, which is a dream publication. I thought that was the pinnacle of everything. It was like, I've always wanted to be published in this magical journal I grew up reading. And then it was all of a sudden everywhere. And that was terrifying and humbling and exciting. But it was also kind of sad, I think, because you write something about maybe the lowest you've ever been or an experience that was really hard. And then so many people are like, oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel that way too. And as a writer, of course, you want to put a finger on something that other people feel and you want to connect with people. But also, I don't want other people to feel that way. I wish so much better for them. And so it made me wonder, like, what does it mean that that felt that way? It's worrying. And I'm glad we connected, but oof.
Tell people about why it was sad and what is in the piece other than the visit to the whooping cranes, because those aren't particularly tragic.
You're right. They are doing better, but we must protect them. No, the piece is about how I had this trip scheduled to go study the whooping crane. And then I decided I was engaged and I decided not to get married. I called off the wedding not too much more than a week before I was scheduled to go. And I was, I don't know, walking around weeping, wondering why I was so bad at romance. And I was like, am I actually still going to go study the whooping crane? And so, I don't know, I decided to still go on the trip. And it wound up being the best thing that could have possibly happened. The people I met there were incredible. And we took such lovely care of each other out in the field. And the essay is two strands that are talking in different ways about sustainability and needs in terms of the environment and animals, but also in terms of how I really was trying to not have any needs because I find it embarrassing to have needs, and how I thought that if I didn't need any care, that would make me lovable. And so I think that's the part that so many people maybe responded to.
Tell us a little bit about the literary nugget nested inside that essay, the Japanese folktale of the crane wife, when you first read it, whether you knew of it before you wrote the piece and how that came to be.
I think I had heard of it before. I grew up in a family where we read. So we had a million sort of compendiums of like stories from around the world with beautiful illustrations. And so I think I had come across it before. But it's so important to say, there are a lot of different versions of the story. And I've had lovely notes from people in Japan who have told me that this is not the most common one. And so I want to first of all say that. But the Odds Bodkins version, which is the one that I read and was familiar with, is a version where a crane is married to a man and she's disguised as a woman in the daytime. And then at night, she's a crane again. And she has to pluck out her feathers to become a woman again. And this idea of like, I must do this so he will still love me. And this action of making yourself, like destroying yourself and shaping yourself in order to feel worthy of love, instead of just being a creature who needs to be taken care of, like any of us.
How did thinking of that piece, not just its great success, but just substantively inform what you built around it in the book? Or how did you go from that to thinking about how you wanted to tell the larger story?
I'm stubborn. And so at first I was like, I'm not going to write a whole book. I will certainly not do that. I will go off and write this weird novel that I am working on. And then I don't know, I kept having ideas of other things that I was like, well, I could write that and I could write that. But I wanted to make sure I was really earnestly invested in writing a book, and not just spinning out an essay into something bigger if it didn't need to be. And the sort of book that I decided I would actually be interested in writing, the book that this turned out to be, is one that's sort of like, okay, how did I get here? If the Crane Wife essay is, I can't believe I ever got myself into the situation being how I was talking to myself and behaving, what came before. And that's where the hope chest of family love stories and all that comes in. It's about the years that came after that and how I tried to date in new ways. Spoilers, it doesn't go well. And then it's about like redefining how I think about love so that I can say like, there's so much love in my life. Like when I am partnered, when I am not partnered, that doesn't matter. There's a lot of love in my life, and building essays that make meaning from those loves so that they're legible and communicable.
So if you wrote a bit to talk about how you got here, there's also the idea of the future. And in her review, Mary Laura Philpott also writes that she, meaning you, is hell-bent on better understanding how the person she is now differs from the person she thought she would be, and what that difference means for the years that lie ahead. Do you think that writing these essays or even just thinking your way through them has changed the future? What comes next, and how has going through all of these things changed your outlook or even your behavior maybe?
Oh my goodness. I have a friend who is a scholar of the writer Rosa Monteras, and she told me this story the other day of something she was translating where Monteras says that the writer is sort of the nonfiction writer, the essayist is like a beetle and an entomologist at once. It's like a beetle who has put on little glasses to study a beetle's behavior. And my friend told me about this because she was like, this is you. You are that beetle. And I think, am I changing the way I live my life because I've scrutinized it in this way in the book? Maybe, but I think it will be good. I think only in good ways.
Yeah, I meant it as a positive, just to
Yeah.
just to be clear. I feel like, if you've thought through things, I do think there are moments in the book where you suggest that you're trying to try new things in order to see if the things you've done before, if they didn't work, what could be possible.
I hope that's true. And I think it's true. But I also talk about in the robot convention essay, there's this part with these 3 differently weighted doors that at the robot trial, the robot has to go through. And I turned it into this metaphor, which I found to be true, that there's a difference between understanding there's something going on that's like not working for you, that there's a problem. And then you like have the epiphany. And I put a lot of stock in epiphanies. It's like, I understand everything now. But like the difference between having the epiphany and then actually being able to, I don't know, heal yourself, change your behavior, if that's what you want to do. Sometimes we conflate the understanding with the, and now it's fine.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's, I think, about where I'm at these days. I'm going for that third door between epiphany and putting it into practice.
I think there's a self-help book in this, Act on the Epiphany. That's what we need to
Oh, I like that.
figure out. I should say that I think people are probably getting a sense, but I want to make clear that this book is very funny and full of aphoristic insights into the human condition. The essay collection, again, is The Crane Wave. CJ Hauser, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
Oh, it was a delight. Thank you so much.
Our reporter, Alexandra Alter, is here with news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, John.
So race relations, racism have been very much in the national conversation for several years now in a heightened way, and a new group of books are tackling it from a certain angle. What's going on?
So there are a couple of really interesting novels coming out at the same time. And whenever I see a group of writers tackling the same ideas, albeit in different ways, it always grabs my interest. And so this summer, there are 2 very interesting novels that look at racial identity in either a surreal way or in some cases in a satirical way. One of them, which is just out, is Harry Sylvester Bird by Chinelo Okparanta. And this is her second novel, her third book, and her first really overt satire, I would say. And it is set in an alternate America that's contemporary. It's very recognizable. There's political extremism, there's a pandemic. And the main character is this very unusual young man named Harry, who is a white man from Pennsylvania. His parents are extremely racist and bigoted, and he's horrified by their attitudes and behavior. And so he does what any self-respecting, rebellious young person does and moves to New York City to reinvent himself. But he reinvents himself in a very strange way. He decides that he's going to start identifying as a Black man from Africa, because that's who he feels that he really is. And he goes to these support groups called Transracial Anon, where they try to coach people on how to move away from their white identity and deal with their white shame. And so when I spoke to Okparanta about the inspiration for this book, she was very candid about the fact that this was a very explosive subject and a strange way into it. And part of what she was trying to address and grapple with was the whole idea of writing outside of your own experience and cultural appropriation. And when she decided to write about a white man who was uncomfortable with his racial identity and wanted to identify in a different way, but does so in a way that's quite offensive to some of the people around him, in a way that resembles cultural appropriation, she decided to make it pretty explicitly a satire as a buffer to show readers and other writers that she knew what she was doing was quite extreme.
So Harry's a comical character.
He's somewhat sympathetic because you can see the pain that he's experienced, but the way that he approaches his own race and others, is his sort of well-meaning efforts are, he always gets in his own way, let's say. He's just blind to his own implicit bigotry. The type of racism that Operanta said she wanted to really explore was not the overt racism that you see from white supremacists, say, but more from, as she put it to me, like well-meaning white people who maybe want to think of themselves as allies, but still have these implicit views that are offensive and harmful. So that was one of the books that I wrote about. Another that's coming out soon called The Last White Man is also very overtly about racial identity, but this is a novel from Mohsin Hamid, and he tackles the subject in a very different way. In his novel, a white man wakes up one morning and has dark skin. This man named Anders, who lives in an unidentified European country. And this condition starts spreading through the town, and people's reactions to it are just very revealing of their bigotry. But it's also a love story. It's a very strange novel, but he's someone who I've been following for a while, and I always find his work very interesting because he does look at contemporary issues and controversial issues, but often with kind of a veil of magical realism. His last novel, Exit West, was about the refugee crisis and migration, particularly migration from countries in the Middle East and Asia where war and extremism has been a problem. And to explore that issue, he created this kind of fantastical version of contemporary Europe and America where their refugees were able to escape through magic doors.
You mentioned in the piece that in addition to that previous book by him, that there's a long history in recent decades, such satirical writers like Ishmael Reed, Percival Everett, Matt Johnson, Paul Beatty. I think of Everett's Erasure and Paul Beatty's The Sellout. They're very biting books, but they're very funny. So I assume that these new books have a combination of that, where there's some scathingness, but you're also laughing a lot.
The writers that I talked to, with books coming out either this summer or recently, spoke a lot about how satire can give you the freedom to write about things that make people very uncomfortable. And particularly when I think for Chanel Operanta, when she was thinking about a white audience coming to her novel, she wanted to use the humor kind of both as a weapon, but also as a buffer in some ways. And in the case of Mohsin Hamid's novel, it's not, I wouldn't say a satire in the same way, but it's very surreal. And I think for him, he saw that as a way to heighten this idea that race is often imagined and invented and then imposed on people, that there are these ideas that get calcified. And so he thought by making something that was so clearly unreal, it could allow people to re-examine their views about race. It was interesting that both Operanta and Hamid have been thinking about these novels for a long time. In Operanta's case, she started thinking about it several years ago when she was teaching a class at Columbia, a writing class, and they were talking about the issue of cultural appropriation in novels like William Styron's The Confession of Nat Turner, or in Memoirs of a Geisha, books where white writers had tried to write about someone from another background. And she said it was a very heated but very interesting conversation because people's views weren't aligned. And so that made her think about how she might write about a white man and how she would approach that. And in Mohsin Hamid's case, he actually had the idea for this novel, he told me, 20 years ago after September 11th, when he realized people were looking at him differently overnight. He had always felt like he was part of a kind of privileged group. He'd never had issues traveling or things like that. And suddenly he said having brown skin and a Muslim name changed people's perceptions of him. And that was something that was in the back of his head for a long time too. But I think both of them reevaluated those ideas in the context of the current conversation over both racism and cultural appropriation.
So long percolating projects that are out at a very relevant moment. Operanta's book is out now, and I believe Hamid's comes out in a couple of weeks. And for now, people can go online and read the rest of your piece and see what other things they had to say about them. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me, John.
My colleagues Lauren Christensen and Shumana Khatib join me now to talk about books we've been reading recently. Good to have you both back.
Hey, John.
Hey, everybody.
Lauren, let's start with you. What do you got?
Sure. So I am reading a book that just came out this month, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, who I know has been a guest on this podcast. I also know she's written many other books, but this sadly, or I don't know, was the first I've read so far. And I'm really, based on this, eager to read more of her work. So on the surface, it's a novel about gamers. I read it in spite of my complete apathy for online games, except for Words with Friends, which John and I play every day. But it is, so this book takes place at the dawn of the internet age. Sam Mazer and Sadie Green, who are the two protagonists, they're undergrads at Harvard and MIT respectively, and they reconnect after knowing each other as children and decide to build a video game together. This launches their career as pretty successful financially game developers. But this was a period in internet history when it was possible for kids to just kind of get together, build such a thing from scratch on their own, and also just personally between them. This was also a time when coding language was just rare enough that it felt like a language they could share between themselves. And it just builds this amazing relationship that lasts for their adult lives that we see of 3 decades that this book spans. But when they meet their kids and they're in a children's hospital, he is recovering from a debilitating car accident that leaves him with a horrible foot injury that plagues him his whole life. And she's there for her older sister who has cancer. They meet in this game room in the children's hospital and they just play a video game together and get along and don't really talk about much of anything, I guess, like normal kid conversation. And then later, Sadie finds out that he's the first person she's spoken to since his accident weeks before. And so that kind of begins this really innate connection that the two of them have. And that develops and becomes more complex over their lives as they just become fuller people. And what's interesting is that they're working at a time when there are no women in the gaming world. And the gaming world is by and large interested in playing games created by boys, for boys, men, whatever. And so the two of them together, they decide to give their character, who's named Ichigo, make their character genderless. So there are all these questions of like, who's the audience for this? Do we want to be really successful or do we want to build something that's really true to our kind of particular idiosyncratic interests? And I'll kind of spare all the details, but I think I just basically love this book for a lot of the same reasons that I loved a very different story, but Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. I think these are two writers who are just pure storytellers and who have such complete control over the stories that they're telling, even as they unspool in sometimes messy directions. And I guess just in any work of fiction, people talk about world building, and here there are just multiple levels of that, game worlds and past worlds and internal worlds kind of, I guess, layered on top of each other just really skillfully. And again, I'm no gamer, but I just think the metaphor for mortality is really powerful to me. Like, it's just really silly and existential. But I remember, like, as a kid, the first time I grasped that I would eventually die, I remember comparing that in my mind to like a game, like whether it's like Oregon Trail or Tetris or something. It's like, how can game just be over and you don't have another life? And I think this book really expands on that. And that's what these kids are reckoning with as they become adults.
I think Zevin has said that's explicitly one of the themes in the book, the idea of extra lives and starting over and being able to do that in a game versus real life. And she's also talked about the fact that the Oregon Trail generation, of which she's a member, is, you know, I think that's a little beyond my time. Tetris, yes. Oregon Trail, I'm not really familiar with it.
It puts the fear in God of you for dysentery speaking as a member.
Oh, yes. Which factors into this book pretty heavily. That's a motif. No spoiler. But...
Well, now when you become a huge gamer, we'll be able to trace it back to the moment. So that's interesting.
Exactly.
Shimano, what are you reading these days?
Well, there is still a threat of severe illness in this book that I'm reading. And dedicated listeners of the Book Review podcast will remember that I am reading tremendously out of date books between The Secret History and The Last Samurai. So I am now going to Norman Rush's Mating.
Oh boy.
Yes. And I remember I found this in a used bookstore around the corner from my apartment and managed to grab it. And some woman actually, I think, hissed at me. This is if you want to talk about second and third lives, this book is really having it in central Brooklyn. So anyway, triumphant, I returned home, and it's this 500-page, it's a real romance, right? And it follows this woman who is an anthropologist in Botswana. She is in her 30s and her research is stalling. She's been living in the bush and she realizes, I need to reevaluate. So she comes back to the capital, and there are some really great party scenes where she's talking about mingling with the other expats and the types of people. There's a very specific kind of typology that you see, almost like down to the genus and species of who you see, who's living in Southern Africa. So it's taking place in Botswana in the 1980s. And there are sort of rumblings that this enigmatic American academic named Nelson Denoon is around. And he's working on this very mysterious project. It's almost like a Shangri-La for matrilineal society deep in the desert. And our narrator is totally infatuated by this guy. She's stimulated intellectually. She feels some kind of emotional stirring. And she sets off on this quest to really court him and build a life. Norman and his wife spent several years in Botswana in the Peace Corps. And that time has really influenced a lot of his fiction from what I can tell. But this actually is kind of an amazing, very hermetic. I don't tend to read a lot of explicit love stories. There are many happy endings or less than happy endings. I don't know how this will turn out quite yet, but this has the feeling where you're just totally walled in with this couple, and they get a lot of their intellectual and romantic and kind of erotic charge from how they talk to one another. They think of each other as intellectual equals. They challenge each other that way. There's this great word that I don't know if it exists outside of Rush's writing called an idioverse, talking about the shared language that you develop with somebody you're close with or you're intimate with, not necessarily in a romantic relationship. Anyway, I look forward to throwing that around at every possible convenience. And it's been wonderful to lose yourself. Right now, I'm at the moment where one of her donkeys has run off and abandoned her. And I was thinking, oh my God, she got ghosted by her donkey. Anyway, so John, tell us about what kind of beasts of burden are in your reading right now.
It's funny, there is a character in costume in what I'm going to read from, but I will say briefly about Mating that I read it many years ago, but it is a very memorable reading experience. Even if the specifics don't all come back to me quickly, it is a wild book. It contains both some of the greatest writing you'll ever read, but it's also so baggy and crazy in its construction and its ideas that there are pages that just seem batty, but it doesn't take away from the overall sense that it's a great book and that I would urge people to read it. I'm reading something that is kind of the opposite in its construction. It's very slender, and it's Charles Portis's first novel, Norwood, which I'm rereading, which is rare for me. I don't reread many things, but I read this quite a long time ago now, and I had actually lost my copy. And I found one recently, a nice copy that replicates my previous one. Portis is by far, I think, still most famous as the author of True Grit, but he was written about for so long as an undervalued or underread writer that I think he probably became as read as he was going to be. If you haven't read him by now, it's not for lack of essays telling you to. We had a brilliant one by Donna Tartt in the book review soon after he died, and he died in 2020 at 86, but he was famously publicity shy and only wrote 5 books. Norwood, this one came out in 1966, and the last one came out in 1991, and he didn't publish any fiction after that. So he's kind of a mysterious guy. True Grit is fantastic. The Dog of the South is a comic novel that's really funny. Norwood is very strange. It's about this guy named Norwood Pratt, and he's an ex-Marine, and he's sent on this mission to go to New York City by a kind of shady character. And he basically has this dream of going across the country and having all these adventures. It's kind of a demented take on the American road trip. You know, Portis's humor is very dry, and I am going to, maybe against my better judgment, read a scene that I always found really funny, and who knows how it'll come across. And it's going to require me to, I'm going to try to do this with subtlety, a couple of different characters talking to each other. So here Norwood is, having arrived in New York. It says, he walked up as far as 59th Street, where things began to peter out, then came back. There was a man in a Mr. Peanut outfit in front of the planter's place, but he was not giving out sample nuts. He was just walking back and forth. The Mr. Peanut casing looked hot. It looked thick enough to give protection against small arms fire. Do they pay you by the hour or what? Norwood said to the monocled peanut face. Yeah, by the hour, said a wary, muffled voice inside. I bet that suit is heavy. And it's not all that heavy. I just started this morning. How much do you get an hour? You ask a lot of questions, don't you? Do you take the suit home with you? No, I put it on down here at the shop. The one in Dallas gives out free nuts. I don't know anything about that. They didn't say anything to me about it. He don't give you many, just 2 or 3 cashews. I don't know anything about that. I work at the post office at night. Well, I'll see you sometime, Mr. Peanut. You take it easy. Okay, you too. So that's Charles Portis.
John, you should be an audiobook narrator.
Well, Yeah, my takeaway is not that I should change careers, but I appreciate that. I think that probably people who already are familiar with Portis will understand why that's so funny out of context. But people who haven't read him, it isn't all just conversations with mascots. And I would highly urge people, if you want to start with True Grit, you can. It's the obvious one. And it's kind of a perfect book in its way, but I think all of them are worth reading. So that's what I'm into these days. And of course, I'm plowing through more Iris Murdoch, but I just feel like people are so tired of hearing me talk about it that I'd skip a week. Okay, let's go over what we read again this week.
I read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin.
I'm reading Mating by Norman Rush.
And I'm reading Norwood by Charles Portis. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.